Deciding to see firsthand if his Help the Homeless policy was being upheld, he stepped into his bar disguised as a beggar. He owned several bars, and rumors were spreading that the staff resented his policy, so he wanted to see if his efforts were genuine. Everything seemed normal until his manager approached him with a stern look. What the manager said next left him completely stunned and questioning everything he thought he knew. With an old jacket and worn-out shoes, the disguised owner shuffled into the bar. He glanced around, taking in the familiar, yet now strangely different atmosphere. His usually commanding presence was hidden beneath layers of ragged clothing. No one paid him any mind, which suited him just fine. He wanted to see the place from a different viewpoint, a test for his staff and their commitment to his policy. As he moved further inside, the owner noticed the familiar clinking of glasses and the low hum of chatter. The lunchtime crowd was as bustling as ever, people laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying their meals. Everything seemed just as it should be, yet he was here to see if his staff shared the laughter and courtesy with everyone, even those who seemed down on their luck. His eyes wandered over the sea of faces, searching for any signs of mistreatment. Everyone seemed content, lost in their own little worlds. But as he scanned, he wondered how his staff would react should someone in need approach. Would they extend a hand or dismiss them as just another nuisance? Today, he intended to find out firsthand. Slowly, he made his way to the bar counter. He approached it with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. The staff had no idea he was the owner, which would make their treatment of him a real eye-opener. As he caught the bartender's eye, he hoped that the values he preached were genuinely being practiced. The bartender, a burly fellow named Jake, paused as he noticed the owner's ragged appearance. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with a professional smile. "What can I get for you, sir?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious. The owner nodded, preparing to see if this was just a facade or genuine hospitality. After placing a modest drink order, the owner picked a spot in the corner where shadows danced along the walls. From here, he could observe without drawing too much attention. It was the perfect spot to watch the interactions between the staff and patrons. Settling in, he wondered what revelations the day might bring. As he sipped his drink, the owner kept his eyes on the crowd. He was gauging each exchange between customers and staff, noticing the small details, like the welcoming smiles and the attentive service. Yet, beneath the surface, he sensed an undercurrent. With every glance and word exchanged, he was searching for sincerity, or lack thereof. Across the room, he observed an older couple struggling to get their server's attention. They seemed in need of assistance, but found none forthcoming. Frowning, the owner wondered if this was just poor service or something more. It was a small event, but such details could speak volumes in his quest for the truth. Near the bar, a group of friends erupted in laughter, drawing curious glances from those around them. Their joy was infectious, lightening the bar's atmosphere. Still, it was not lost on the owner that such merriment was a privilege not everyone enjoyed. Today, amidst the laughter and good times, his mission was clear, ensuring compassion wasn't overlooked, even in the midst of joy. The owner, dressed in shabby clothes, sat at his seat, watching closely. Everything seemed normal, but he wasn't in a rush. He wanted to catch every detail and observe the atmosphere. People around him chatted and laughed, barely noticing him. He was just another face in the crowd, and that suited him perfectly. He needed to see if the kindness extended beyond the familiar faces, especially to someone who seemed out of place. As the owner took in the surroundings, he noticed the bartender, Jake, huddled with a server named Lily. They were whispering, glancing his way occasionally. The owner leaned in slightly, curious about their conversation. Were they discussing who he thought they were, or was it just normal bar talk? The touch of secrecy in their exchange piqued his interest as he continued to watch them closely, trying to decipher their intentions. The owner strained to catch bits of their low conversation. Not sure what to do if he heard Jake say quietly. Lily nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's just strange. We never get—" She replied, her words hushed. The pieces he heard didn't make sense yet. Their conversation seemed important, and the owner knew he needed to understand their discussion better if he wanted to get to the bottom of it. With their occasional glances, Jake and Lily made the owner feel like he was under a microscope. Even though he was trying his best to remain inconspicuous, he couldn't shake the feeling of being scrutinized. Every once in a while, their eyes would dart in his direction, making him question if they were onto him or if he was being overly cautious. Either way, the tension in the air was palpable. The door swung open and the manager, Mr. Davis, strode in, his eyes scanning the bar with an intensity that matched the owner's own gaze. The old man's heart quickened a bit, but he remained still, watching the man who ran his establishment in his stead. Mr. Davis's gaze moved deliberately, as if assessing each patron and staff member carefully. The owner wondered what Mr. Davis thought of the midday scene unfolding before him. The owner adjusted his seat, pulling his cap lower and crossing his arms loosely. He had chosen his attire specifically to fit in with those who were often overlooked. As Mr. Davis's eyes swept over him without a second glance, the owner felt a small relief mixed with trepidation. It was crucial that he blend in without drawing unnecessary attention to himself. Only then could he truly gauge how others in his condition were treated. The owner watched as Mr. Davis walked over to a group of regulars sitting at a nearby table. Their animated conversation paused as he approached. With smiles and friendly handshakes, the manager chatted them up, all the while keeping an occasional glance at the owner's direction. He seemed genuinely invested in their stories, but his frequent glances added an unsettled layer to the interaction. Was the manager aware of the disguised presence? As Mr. Davis conversed with the regulars, his demeanor was outwardly warm and engaging. Still, every few moments, his eyes flitted towards the owner, betraying a hint of nervousness. Was it intuition or just coincidence? The owner couldn't help but wonder if the manager suspected something or if it was just how he operated under the scrutiny of his boss, albeit unbeknownst in disguise. The signals from the manager were certainly mixed. Jake returned to the bar, expertly refilling drinks as he murmured to the staff members who came by. The owner noted each covert exchange, trying to piece together what they might be discussing. Staff whispered among themselves, even as they attended to patrons, creating an air of secrecy that hung heavy. The owner remained intent on uncovering whether these hushed words held any importance or if he was reading into shadows. The entrance bell jingled gently as an elderly man cautiously entered, seeking respite from the chilly air outside. The owner watched closely, wondering how the newcomer would be received. Instead of a warm welcome, the elderly man was met with indifferent glances and unconcerned expressions. The contrast to the lively chatter among the regulars was striking, and the owner's heart sank as he witnessed the cold reception given to someone in need. The owner sat quietly, feeling a tug of doubt about whether his staff truly believed in the Help the Homeless policy. He hoped his efforts were making a difference, but wondered if the team really shared his enthusiasm. Looking around, he saw employees chatting and serving, but did they act the same when nobody was watching? He intended to find out as he observed from his hidden corner. A young woman stepped inside the bar, her eyes scanning the room full of chatter and laughter. Approaching the counter, she caught the bartender's attention. The young woman paused, anticipation clearly written on her face as she waited for a reply. She seemed genuinely interested, as if she cared about understanding more. The owner watched closely, wondering if his staff would provide the kind of compassionate response that aligned with the bar's values. It was a moment of truth, and the air hung with expectancy as he observed the unfolding interaction. From his seat, the owner leaned in, his focus on the conversation at hand. This was exactly the kind of moment he was here to witness. His heartbeat quickened slightly as he listened closely, wanting to see if the staff would uphold what he stood for. Would the young woman receive the respect and information she sought, or would she be brushed aside? Every word mattered now as he continued to listen. Jake hesitated for a moment, glancing around as if weighing his options. Eventually, he gestured towards a colorful flyer pinned to the wall. "There's some info right there," he said, a hint of reluctance in his tone. The owner watched as Jake's response felt less personal than he had hoped, prompting questions in his mind about the true nature of his team's commitment to the cause. The woman nodded, her smile fading into a shadow of disappointment. She gave Jake a polite "thank you" and walked over to the flyer, looking it over. The owner's heart felt a little heavy watching her leave without the acknowledgement he believed should have been offered. Her curiosity had been met with a vague gesture, not the warm welcome and information he had intended to provide for all. Just then, a group of business professionals pushed through the door, their voices loud and commanding. They drew almost every eye in the room as they arranged themselves at a large table. The bar's dynamic shifted, the lively newcomers demanding the swift attention of the staff. The owner observed this change in atmosphere, noting how quickly the focus shifted to them, overshadowing quieter interactions. The professionals' voices rose, overlapping each other as they ordered drinks and talked over one another. Their presence disrupted the bar's balance, making it hard for quieter conversations to continue. The owner saw staff hurrying to meet their needs, but he couldn't help wondering, did their demeanor earn them special treatment? He kept watch, determined to see how the rest of the room responded to the shift. The manager watched the scene with a careful eye, assessing each group in the bar. His face showed a mix of concern and calculation, clearly weighing the importance of keeping every customer satisfied. With the professionals making demands, the manager seemed torn between attending to them and ensuring everyone else, like the young woman earlier, wasn't neglected. The owner noted every decision, aware of how these choices revealed the bar's true priorities. The disguised owner couldn't shake the thought of how appearances played such a huge role in the bar. It seemed people with fancier clothes got more attention, while those looking for help were left to read flyers on the wall. He watched the room, sensing a dichotomy in service that bothered him deeply. This test, set in motion by his own hand, was revealing more than he anticipated. As the owner observed the bar, he began to assemble a concerning picture of its workings. Despite the friendly smiles and casual chatter, there seemed to be a discomfort beneath it all. Staff exchanged nervous glances whenever the door opened or someone new entered. The air felt heavy with something unspoken that hinted at a deeper issue. The owner's curiosity deepened, and he knew he had to stay vigilant to uncover the truth. The door creaked open, and a young man in ragged clothes entered. His appearance caused a ripple among the staff, who exchanged furtive looks. The owner watched closely, wondering how his team would handle the situation. The young man shuffled toward a bar stool, trying to blend in despite his shabby appearance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as attention shifted to this unexpected newcomer. Jake, the bartender, set down his towel and approached the young man. Clearing his throat, Jake offered, "Can I get you a glass of water, buddy?" His tone was polite, though tinged with caution. The owner watched intently, noting how it was the bare minimum of kindness. He waited to see if hospitality would extend beyond a simple glass of water, hoping for more from his staff. The young man hesitated, looked down, and murmured a quiet, "Thank you." Then he took the glass, retreating to the end of the bar. There, he sat alone, casting glances around the room. The owner watched the scene unfold, relieved by the initial kindness shown, but curious to see how the staff would continue to treat this outsider. A simple gesture of kindness wasn't enough to gauge the true nature of the bar's atmosphere. The owner couldn't shake the feeling that the staff was on edge with each new arrival. There was a visible tension every time the door opened. He watched servers and bartenders share worried looks, their eyes often darting toward the manager. The owner had hoped for seamless compassion, but instead saw a crack in the friendly facade. He remained in his corner, trying to piece together the root of this unease. Sitting quietly, the owner could sense the unease among his staff, waiting for him to uncover the hidden issue. He saw the little nods and quick conversations, all hinting at something unsaid. While the place was lively on the surface, undertones of anxiety wove through every smile and small interaction. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what he might discover, but he knew he had to keep digging. Two employees slipped into the back room, sharing a whispered conversation. The owner watched them go, his curiosity piqued. Their secrecy added another layer to the mystery he was trying to solve. Whatever they were discussing seemed important and potentially revealing. He waited a bit, planning his next move, determined to find out how his policy was truly being handled when he wasn't around to oversee it personally. The owner quietly moved closer to the door of the back room. He found a spot where he could catch snippets of the conversation without being seen. Leaning in, he tried to make sense of the hushed voices. The voices were mostly muffled, but he managed to catch a manager's name, Mr. Davis, but not much else. It was frustrating not to have the full picture, so he decided to head back and continue observing. As he leaned in through the small gap in the door, he strained his ears, trying to grab anything useful. The word manager floated through, along with some hurried, indistinct phrases. It was irritating to only get bits and pieces when he needed clarity. Frustrated but patient, he retreated to his seat. He knew the next part of the day could offer more clues if he kept vigilant. Returning to his seat, the owner settled down, eyes fixed on the bar's buzz. He knew he had to stay patient. Connecting the dots wasn't about rushing, it was about timing. With hours left in his unofficial investigation, he waited, hoping the truth would reveal itself before long. His mind buzzed with clues and observations, and he was determined to piece it all together by day's end. Sitting in the corner, the owner grew more frustrated. He watched people come and go, each interaction not quite meeting his hopes. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces. Instead of friendly chats and smiles, he noticed rushed gestures and forced politeness. His expectations of a warm atmosphere weren't adding up, and this made his heart sink a little. The casual indifference was hard to ignore, and he wondered if things were really as they seemed. The owner noticed when the manager, Mr. Davis, returned to the bar. He leaned in close to Jake, whispering something. Their conversation was quiet, but their body language said a lot. The manager's intense look and Jake's puzzled nod were clear signs of something brewing. The owner watched, curious but cautious, wondering what was being discussed. The whole scene left him questioning what was going on behind the scenes, underneath the everyday routine. Jake's face suddenly lost color, his eyes flicking nervously toward the owner. It was a look that spoke louder than any words. He seemed to know something important, but was unsure how to handle it. The owner kept his expression neutral, even as Jake's anxious gaze kept returning to him. The tension was almost palpable, and the atmosphere in the bar shifted slightly, like everyone could sense something was about to unfold. Jake was visibly uneasy, his eyes bouncing between Mr. Davis and the disguised owner, like a pinball. The bartender's nervousness was contagious, making others at the bar glance around curiously. The disguised owner began to piece together the day's insights. Little clues from interactions, hesitant service, and now the nervous bartender were forming a bigger picture. He had hoped for warmth and open hospitality, but each encounter hinted at something else. With each puzzle piece, the owner's suspicions grew. Were his bars practicing what they preached, or was there a layer of insincerity he hadn't seen before? His heart was heavy with unspoken questions. As he sat silently, he debated what to do next. Should he continue observing or confront the manager and staff about their actions? He needed a clear understanding of his team's commitment. But was it time to reveal his true identity or stay in disguise a bit longer? The owner watched them go, his curiosity piqued. Their secrecy added another layer to the mystery he was trying to solve. Whatever they were discussing seemed important and potentially revealing. He waited a bit, planning his next move, determined to find out how his policy was truly being handled when he wasn't around to oversee it personally. The owner quietly moved closer to the door of the back room. He found a spot where he could catch snippets of the conversation without being seen. Leaning in, he tried to make sense of the hushed voices. The voices were mostly muffled, but he managed to catch a manager's name, Mr. Davis, but not much else. It was frustrating not to have the full picture, so he decided to head back and continue observing. As he leaned in through the small gap in the door, he strained his ears, trying to grab anything useful. The word manager floated through, along with some hurried, indistinct phrases. It was irritating to only get bits and pieces when he needed clarity. Frustrated but patient, he retreated to his seat. He knew the next part of the day could offer more clues if he kept vigilant. Returning to his seat, the owner settled down, eyes fixed on the bar's buzz. He knew he had to stay patient. Connecting the dots wasn't about rushing, it was about timing. With hours left in his unofficial investigation, he waited, hoping the truth would reveal itself before long. His mind buzzed with clues and observations, and he was determined to piece it all together by day's end. Sitting in the corner, the owner grew more frustrated. He watched people come and go, each interaction not quite meeting his hopes. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces. Instead of friendly chats and smiles, he noticed rushed gestures and forced politeness. His expectations of a warm atmosphere weren't adding up, and this made his heart sink a little. The casual indifference was hard to ignore, and he wondered if things were really as they seemed. The owner noticed when the manager, Mr. Davis, returned to the bar. He leaned in close to Jake, whispering something. Their conversation was quiet, but their body language said a lot. The manager's intense look and Jake's puzzled nod were clear signs of something brewing. The owner watched, curious but cautious, wondering what was being discussed. The whole scene left him questioning what was going on behind the scenes, underneath the everyday routine. Jake's face suddenly lost color, his eyes flicking nervously toward the owner. It was a look that spoke louder than any words. He seemed to know something important, but was unsure how to handle it. The owner kept his expression neutral, even as Jake's anxious gaze kept returning to him. The tension was almost palpable, and the atmosphere in the bar shifted slightly, like everyone could sense something was about to unfold. Jake was visibly uneasy, his eyes bouncing between Mr. Davis and the disguised owner, like a pinball. The bartender's nervousness was contagious, making others at the bar glance around curiously. The disguised owner began to piece together the day's insights. Little clues from interactions, hesitant service, and now the nervous bartender were forming a bigger picture. He had hoped for warmth and open hospitality, but each encounter hinted at something else. With each puzzle piece, the owner's suspicions grew. Were his bars practicing what they preached, or was there a layer of insincerity he hadn't seen before? His heart was heavy with unspoken questions. As he sat silently, he debated what to do next. Should he continue observing or confront the manager and staff about their actions? He needed a clear understanding of his team's commitment. But was it time to reveal his true identity or stay in disguise a bit longer? Would it align with his hopes or fall short like others he'd seen? Armed with quiet determination, he kept gathering every drop of insight. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a local charity representative named Tom strolled in. The owner's attention piqued, as he knew this visit was about discussing donations. Tom approached the bar with an enthusiastic demeanor. Would this meeting reveal if their Help the Homeless policy was really being upheld? The owner strained to hear the conversation, curious to see if his team's commitment would shine through during this important interaction. Tom caught the manager's attention, but Mr. Davis seemed distracted, his eyes darting across the room. His demeanor was anything but engaged, and Tom's attempt at conversation struggled to take hold. The owner watched, intrigued by the manager's distant approach, despite the significance of this encounter. Would Mr. Davis refocus, or let this slip through the cracks? The owner leaned in, focusing on Tom's words and Mr. Davis's response. He listened intently, eager to gauge the authenticity behind the manager's promises. Would there be genuine engagement or just surface-level chatter? The conversation unfolded, the outcome hanging in the balance. As Mr. Davis nodded along to Tom's words, the owner felt a mix of hope and skepticism. Knowing how much he'd invested in this policy, he wanted assurance that his intentions weren't misplaced. The conversation between Tom and Mr. Davis sounded polite, but lacked depth. Their words floated around, but never landed, like a dance around substance without ever touching it. The owner's heart sank a little as the exchange failed to reach meaningful resolutions. This might have been cordial, sure, but it wasn't the commitment he'd envisioned. As Tom thanked the manager and walked away, the owner felt the weight of missed opportunities hang heavier than ever. The owner, dressed as a beggar, sat in the dim corner, growing more worried with each passing minute. He noticed small things, the glances exchanged between staff, the hurried service. Though he hoped to see warmth and kindness, what he saw instead were faces that seemed more concerned about keeping up appearances. His heart felt heavy. He couldn't help but question if his efforts to help the community were truly taken to heart by those he trusted. Sitting by the entrance, a group of regulars immediately noticed the owner in disguise. Curious smiles spread across their faces. "Hey there, haven't seen you around before," one of them called out, a friendly lilt in her voice. The owner smiled back, grateful for the genuine warmth he sensed. They started chatting about the town, sharing experiences, like old friends catching up. It was a refreshing change, and he felt his spirits lift just a little. As the conversation continued, the regulars began sharing stories about community efforts aimed at making life better for everyone. They spoke of organizing food drives and neighborhood cleanups, their enthusiasm contagious. Listening to their stories, the owner felt a flicker of hope. It was nice to hear that some folks cared deeply about bringing positive change. For a moment, he let their enthusiasm lift his spirits, reminding him why he started the bar policies in the first place. The owner found himself feeling lighter, even amidst his growing doubts. The positive energy from the regulars painted a picture of promise. Maybe, just maybe, there were seeds of good sprouting amid the challenges faced by his staff. He hoped that their efforts weren't being overshadowed by the internal friction he sensed. Being part of this conversation was a welcome moment of encouragement, a reminder that his intentions weren't entirely lost. Sitting quietly, the owner pondered how each of his bars delivered the Help the Homeless message. Clearly, there were gaps to fill. He wondered how he could communicate his vision more clearly, ensuring everyone understood the importance of consistent compassion and service. Perhaps his directives needed more clarity or reinforcement. Watching the action unfold around him, he started forming ideas about aligning his values more closely across his establishments. With a clearer perspective, the owner made a mental note to address his concerns thoughtfully but firmly. He knew changes were needed, and it was his responsibility to see them through. Taking a deep breath, he resolved to have open conversations with his managers, aiming for real improvement. No more half measures or assumptions. The thought of solving these issues filled him with determination as he planned the next steps he needed to take. The moment between silence and action arrived when the manager, Mr. Davis, called out to him, still in beggar guise, across the room. "Hey you, come here for a sec?" Mr. Davis's tone was firm, a hint of authority echoing through the chatter of the bar. The owner, keeping up his disguise, followed the call, curious and ready for what this encounter might reveal about Mr. Davis's true colors. Despite the Help the Homeless policy, the words from Mr. Davis came as a surprise. "We can't have you loitering around. It's time you left," he stated, eyes firm. The owner stood in stunned silence. The policy was clear, yet here he was being turned away, exactly what he had feared. This incident confirmed his suspicions and guided his next move. Following the manager's authoritative stance, he knew the time for revelations had come. In a commanding but calm voice, the owner finally unveiled his true identity to Mr. Davis. "I think you're mistaken about who I am." The shock on Mr. Davis's face was almost tangible, his stern demeanor suddenly faltering. The room seemed to hold its breath, every eye now locked on the unexpected drama. Clarity sank in as Mr. Davis processed what had just unfolded. The owner was no beggar, but the genuine article. With the truth out, the owner addressed the staff, sharing all he'd witnessed over the course of the day. "I've seen some good, but there's room for improvement," he shared candidly, commitment clear in his voice. He promised them changes, a realignment of values so all patrons experienced the respect they deserved. His closing words reinforced a steady vision, determined to mold an environment worthy of every single person walking through those doors.